For many years, I have watched Donald Trump make decisions that defy basic strategic logic. Some have been reckless, others economically damaging. But the decision to impose tariffs on Canadian energy and the consequences that followed stands out as one of the most ill-judged and unnecessary errors of his political career. The trigger was deceptively simple: a flat 10% tariff on Canadian energy imports, announced with little explanation and even less evidence of serious consultation. There was no sign that those responsible had spoken to energy experts, grid operators, or anyone with a working understanding of how electricity markets function. The assumption appeared to be straightforward. Canada exports energy, therefore Canada can be squeezed. That assumption was wrong. Within days, Quebec's premier, François Legault, was on television outlining the province's ability to restrict electricity exports to New England. He did not frame it as a threat. He presented it as a structural reality, a reminder of leverage that Washington had failed to consider. And that is precisely where the Trump administration miscalculated. It misunderstood the balance of dependency. For more than 40 years, New England has relied heavily on hydroelectric power from Quebec. Vermont sources roughly a quarter of its electricity from Canadian dams. Massachusetts has just completed a decade-long infrastructure project costing more than $1.6 billion, built explicitly to import hydroelectric power from Quebec. That investment was not incidental. It was central to the state's long-term energy strategy. To be clear, Massachusetts spent 10 years and billions of dollars increasing its reliance on Canadian electricity, and then found itself caught in a trade dispute with the very supplier on which that strategy depends. The scale of the relationship is not marginal. Hydro-Quebec supplies approximately 10% of New England's electricity. New York alone imported 7.7 terawatt-hours of power from Quebec and Ontario last year. Two major transmission projects have recently come online, designed to deliver an additional 20 terawatt-hours annually to Massachusetts and New York. These are not short-term market transactions. They are 20-year contracts backed by bespoke infrastructure created specifically to integrate Canadian hydropower into the northeastern U.S. grid. By imposing tariffs, Trump did not merely irritate a trading partner. He handed Quebec a strategic advantage. Legault did not immediately cancel contracts. Doing so would have been legally complex. Instead, he announced that Quebec was examining the legal basis for doing so. The implication was unmistakable. The transmission lines built at enormous expense could remain unused if the dispute escalated. The underlying reason is simple but often misunderstood. Electricity is not oil. It cannot be shipped across oceans or redirected to distant markets. It flows only through physically connected grids. Quebec controls vast hydroelectric assets, dams, reservoirs, and generation capacity, and can choose when to release power based on price and demand. New England, by contrast, relies heavily on natural gas, supplemented by limited nuclear capacity and expanding renewables, yet lacks sufficient clean baseload generation of its own. The dependency is therefore asymmetric, and it does not favor Washington. Most people give little thought to where their electricity comes from. The grid is invisible until it fails. But in New England, a significant portion of that invisible infrastructure is Canadian. Since the 1980s, Quebec has supplied power to the region in a mutually beneficial arrangement. Quebec had surplus generation. New England faced high fossil fuel costs and growing pressure to cut emissions. Canadian hydropower was cheaper, cleaner, and politically expedient. A principal transmission corridor runs roughly 1,300 kilometers from northern Quebec to the Boston area, delivering between 1,200 and 1,400 megawatts on a regular basis, enough to power more than 1 million homes. Vermont operates a separate dedicated line, providing around 225 megawatts, covering roughly a quarter of the state's electricity needs. This is not emergency backup. It is a structural component of the regional grid. Last year, approximately 5% of all electricity consumed in New England came from Canada, almost entirely from Quebec. That share rises sharply during periods of peak demand, in winter cold snaps and summer heat waves, when natural gas prices spike. At those moments, Quebec's hydroelectric power becomes the most economical and stabilizing option available. The value of this arrangement lies not only in volume, but in predictability. Natural gas prices are volatile and highly sensitive to weather. Quebec's electricity is supplied under long-term contracts with stable pricing. Massachusetts consumers were explicitly promised savings of around $50 million per year as a result. That stability, carefully built over decades, was placed at risk the moment trade policy was allowed to override energy reality. For Quebec, electricity exports are not a peripheral concern. They are a significant economic pillar. In 2022, the province earned approximately $1.4 billion from electricity exports to the United States. In 2023, that figure surged to around $3 billion, driven largely by elevated global energy prices following Europe's energy crisis. These revenues matter. They underpin provincial finances and helped Hydro-Quebec deliver a record dividend of $3.4 billion to the Quebec government in 2022. The commercial success of this relationship encouraged deeper integration. Massachusetts and New York did not merely rely on existing supply. They committed to expanding it dramatically. Both states signed long-term contracts for additional hydroelectric power from Quebec, supported by purpose-built transmission infrastructure. These were not speculative decisions. They were foundational to long-term energy planning. In January 2026, after a decade of political disputes, environmental challenges, and legal delays, the New England Clean Energy Connect finally entered operation. The project cost approximately $1.6 billion and involved the construction of a 145-mile high-voltage transmission line running from the Quebec border through Maine to Lewiston. Its capacity, roughly 1,200 megawatts, is sufficient to supply close to 20% of Massachusetts' total electricity demand. Massachusetts utilities signed a 20-year contract securing 1,090 megawatts of that capacity at fixed prices, guaranteeing the delivery of 9.55 terawatt-hours annually, sourced entirely from Quebec's hydroelectric system. This was not an abstract climate pledge. It was a binding commercial agreement backed by physical infrastructure designed to lock in long-term price stability and emissions reductions. At the same time, New York was finalizing the Champlain-Hudson Power Express, a 339-mile underground and underwater transmission cable linking Quebec directly to Queens. With a capacity of 1,250 megawatts, the project is expected to power around 1 million homes in New York City. The associated 20-year contract, also fixed price, is projected to save New York ratepayers approximately $17.3 billion over 3 decades. Together, these two projects represent nearly $13 billion in infrastructure investment. Money already spent, contracts already signed, systems engineered specifically to deepen Massachusetts and New York's dependence on Canadian hydroelectric power. This dependence was not accidental. It was openly embraced by political leadership on both sides of the border. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey publicly celebrated the launch of the New England Clean Energy Connect, describing it as a cornerstone of the state's clean energy transition and a source of affordable, reliable power. In New York, Governor Kathy Hochul was equally enthusiastic, presenting the Champlain-Hudson project as essential to achieving the state's goal of 70% renewable electricity by 2030. In both cases, Canadian hydropower was not treated as supplementary, it was foundational. That context makes the introduction of tariffs all the more disruptive. When Donald Trump announced a 10% tariff on Canadian energy imports in early March 2025, Hydro-Quebec responded swiftly. Electricity exports into New England's wholesale spot market were halted. The second phase of a major transmission corridor fell silent. For more than a week, no power flowed south. Officially, Hydro-Quebec attributed the pause to weather conditions, citing warmer temperatures and reduced profitability in spot market sales. But the timing was conspicuous. Exports stopped just 2 days after the tariffs came into force. The explanation may have been technically plausible, but politically unconvincing. Premier Legault soon clarified the broader position. Quebec, he said, was examining the legal feasibility of withdrawing from the new long-term contracts with Massachusetts and New York if the tariff dispute remained unresolved. He was careful with his language. This was not an ultimatum. It was a calculated signal. Quebec was reminding Washington and the northeastern states that it retained options. Notably, Legault avoided suggesting any disruption to Vermont's long-standing electricity contract in place since 1987. Vermont, he implied, was not the target. The focus was on the newer agreements, contracts that had not yet fully commenced. These, Quebec argued, might be subject to renegotiation or even termination if tariffs fundamentally altered the economic assumptions under which they were signed. Even if outright cancellation proved legally impossible, Quebec still held leverage. The contracts specify minimum delivery volumes, not maximums. Hydro-Quebec could meet its strict contractual obligations while declining to sell additional electricity into the spot market. During periods of peak demand, that distinction becomes critical. In energy policy, margins matter, and in this case, those margins represented the difference between stability and volatility, between predictable pricing and sudden cost shocks. By introducing tariffs, the Trump administration had turned a previously cooperative energy relationship into a strategic vulnerability, not for Canada, but for the American states that had built their future energy systems around it. That distinction between minimum contractual supply and discretionary market sales matters enormously during periods of peak demand. New England depends on imported electricity at precisely the moments when its own system is under the greatest strain. When those imports are constrained, the consequences are immediate and costly. Hydro-Quebec's chief executive, Michael Sabia, made the province's position unmistakably clear in a speech delivered in Montreal in February. He described the Trump administration's approach as that of a bully and warned that Quebec would respond in kind. If Washington chose to impose tariffs on energy, Quebec, he said, was prepared to recover those costs through higher charges on electricity exports. The contracts might limit outright cancellation, but pricing mechanisms still allowed room for maneuver. The message could not have been clearer. The tariffs were intended to impose costs on Canada. In practice, they shifted leverage towards Quebec and exposed the vulnerability of northeastern U.S. states whose grids rely on Canadian power to remain stable and affordable. To understand why this leverage is so potent, one must examine the structure of New England's electricity system. More than 60% of the region's power generation comes from natural gas. That model works tolerably well when gas prices are low. It fails during periods of extreme weather when heating demand, power generation, and fuel supply all compete for the same pipeline capacity. In winter cold snaps and summer heat waves, natural gas prices can rise sharply. Wholesale electricity prices follow. Canadian hydroelectric imports play a critical stabilizing role at precisely these moments. When prices surge in New England, Quebec increases exports, adding supply and dampening volatility. Without that inflow, price spikes would be far more severe and far more visible to consumers. Absent Canadian hydropower, New England faces a stark choice. It can expand natural gas generation, an option that is both expensive and incompatible with stated climate commitments. Or it can attempt to rely on large-scale battery storage to backstop intermittent wind and solar generation, a technology that remains prohibitively costly at the scale required. Neither option offers a realistic short-term solution. Massachusetts and New York recognized this reality. Their decision to import clean, dispatchable hydroelectric power from Quebec was a strategic compromise. Reliable baseload generation without the emissions profile of fossil fuels. But that strategy only functions if the electricity continues to flow. Billions of dollars have been invested in infrastructure that has no alternative use. By introducing tariffs, the Trump administration did more than disrupt existing contracts. It forced Quebec to reconsider whether American states could be trusted as long-term partners. Premier Legault stated openly that the province needed to reassess its assumptions about cooperation with the United States. That assessment extends beyond current agreements to future expansion, additional transmission projects, and deeper energy integration. The potential economic consequences are significant. A reduction of Quebec's electricity exports to New England by just 30% would remove roughly 800 megawatts of capacity from the regional grid. That shortfall would need to be replaced, primarily by more expensive natural gas generation during peak periods. Wholesale prices would rise, household electricity bills would follow, carbon emissions would increase as fossil fuel plants operated more frequently. Quebec, by contrast, would absorb the loss far more easily. The province could redirect power to neighboring Ontario or retain water in its reservoirs for later use. The flexibility lies overwhelmingly on one side of the border. The dependency does not. The scale of what is at stake becomes clearer when one considers the long-term value of this energy relationship. Estimates place the cumulative value of electricity trade between Quebec and the northeastern United States at well over $290 billion through to 2050. The New England Clean Energy Connect alone is contracted to deliver approximately $190 billion worth of electricity over its 20-year lifespan at current prices. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express operates on a similar scale. Add existing transmission agreements and Vermont's dedicated supply, and the figure grows further once inflation and contract renewals are accounted for. This is not simply a question of utility revenue. It is about grid stability, climate policy, and economic competitiveness. Massachusetts promotes itself as a leader in the green economy. New York markets its transition away from fossil fuels as a cornerstone of future growth. Both narratives depend heavily on Canadian hydroelectric power. The tariffs jeopardize that foundation, not because Quebec sought confrontation, but because energy security was turned into a political instrument. Quebec's response served as a reminder that instruments of pressure are rarely one-sided. In this case, the leverage lay precisely where Washington appeared least prepared to find it. The central error underpinning this episode was a flawed assumption about dependency. The Trump administration appeared to believe that energy flows between Canada and the United States were one-directional. America imports oil and gas, therefore Canada requires access to American markets. That logic may apply to hydrocarbons. It does not apply to electricity. Electricity does not move across oceans or shift easily between continents. It flows through fixed infrastructure across physically connected grids. Quebec and New England are bound by that infrastructure. Billions of dollars have been invested on both sides of the border to enable this trade, but the dependence created by that investment is not evenly shared. Quebec controls the dams, the reservoirs, and the generation capacity. It can store water when prices are low and release it when demand and value is higher. New England, meanwhile, operates a system dominated by natural gas, supported by limited nuclear capacity and an expanding but still intermittent renewable sector. The region lacks sufficient domestic clean baseload generation to replace Canadian imports in the short or even medium term. When tariffs were imposed, the intention was to extract revenue from Canadian exports. The result was the opposite. The policy exposed the vulnerability of U.S. states that rely on Quebec's electricity to keep their grids stable and their climate commitments credible. Massachusetts and New York did not initiate a trade dispute with Canada. Their political leaders openly opposed the tariff strategy, yet they became collateral damage because their energy systems depend on a cooperative cross-border relationship. Premier Legault was careful to separate political leadership from the public. His criticism was directed at Washington, not at residents of Massachusetts or New York. But he was equally clear that Quebec would act to defend its own interests. If tariffs were to be used as economic weapons, Quebec would respond with the tools at its disposal. What makes this situation particularly dangerous for New England is the absence of time. Energy infrastructure cannot be built quickly. The New England Clean Energy Connect took a decade to move from concept to operation. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express has been under development for 15 years. If Quebec were to significantly reduce exports, replacing that capacity would take years, not months. The consequences would be immediate and severe. Electricity prices would rise. Grid reliability during peak demand would be compromised. Climate targets would become unattainable. States would be forced to delay the retirement of fossil fuel plants and extend the life of aging infrastructure, directly contradicting their stated environmental goals. The political fallout would follow swiftly. Voters already struggling with energy costs would see further increases. Environmental advocates would watch emissions climb. Businesses drawn to Massachusetts and New York by clean energy commitments would question whether those promises could still be honored. Even if tariffs were lifted tomorrow, the damage would not simply disappear. A precedent has been set. Quebec now understands that American energy policy can shift abruptly and without regard for long-term agreements. Future negotiations, whether on energy, trade, or environmental cooperation, will take place in the shadow of that knowledge. Trump believed tariffs would project strength. Instead, they revealed vulnerability. By forcing the issue, he highlighted the degree to which northeastern U.S. states depend on Canadian electricity and handed Quebec a source of leverage it had never needed to use before. Although the immediate crisis was partially diffused, with tariffs temporarily paused and electricity flows continuing, the underlying trust that sustained 4 decades of cooperation has been weakened. Premier Legault stated plainly that Quebec can no longer view the United States as a partner with the same level of reliability. That is not rhetoric, it is a strategic reassessment. Future energy projects will reflect that shift. Quebec may favor smaller agreements, greater flexibility, and alternative markets such as Ontario. Investment in infrastructure designed solely to serve American demand may be approached with caution. Massachusetts and New York, by contrast, have little room to maneuver. Billions have already been spent on transmission systems that function only if Quebec continues to supply power. The outcome is the reverse of what the tariff policy intended. Rather than extracting value from Canada, it undermined energy security for millions of Americans, placed climate objectives at risk, and signaled to international partners that U.S. trade policy had become unpredictable. Every megawatt of electricity flowing south from Quebec now carries an unspoken reminder. A stable, mutually beneficial relationship was taken for granted and then destabilized by political calculation. The lights remain on, but the certainty that kept them that way has been eroded. This episode illustrates the danger of governance without expertise. Energy policy is not transactional theater. It is complex, interdependent, and unforgiving of impulsive decisions. In this case, the failure to understand that complexity left entire regions exposed, not because of external hostility, but because of avoidable political misjudgment. The vulnerability now exists where it did not before, and it exists because someone in power failed to look beyond the next move.